Right, I think most of us are back. Many of us are back. If people could turn on their pictures, that would be nice, so we could see who's around. Thanks, Tondi. Great, thanks, Dawit. Daniel's going to chair this panel, so I'm going to hand over to him if he's there and ready.
Hello.
Great.
Shall we begin? Hello, everyone. My name is Daniel Mulugeta. I'm a postdoctoral researcher in the ASA project at SOAS University of London. Welcome to the second session of the webinar. I am excited to introduce the second panel this afternoon on the theme of living. The papers in this panel will explore the questions of how citizens live with and in the buildings made for them or the buildings they inherit, and how people engage with buildings, shape them, and have their lives shaped by them. So, as was in the case of the first session, each speaker will have 10 minutes to speak. After that, we will take questions from the audience. So our first speaker will be Irene Appeaning Addo. Irene is a research fellow at the Institute of African Studies at the University of Ghana and a practicing architect in Ghana. Her research focuses on African architecture and urban housing in West Africa. The title of her paper is New Homes for a New State, Foreign Ideas in Ghana's Public Housing Programs. Over to you, Irene.
Thank you. All right, so thank you all. My title, as it has been mentioned already, is New Homes for a New State, Foreign Ideas in Ghana's Public Housing Programs. All right, so let's talk about the outline. Next slide, please. So I would briefly give an introduction, talk about the introduction, and then talk a little bit about the modernist planning, state building, and house building agenda in Ghana during the early years and transitional years of Ghana. And then I'll also talk about the formation of a new state and foreign involvement. So Ghana became independent in 1957, but then self-government started in 1950. So between 1950 and then 1960, 61, that's where my presentation will focus on. And I'll use two case studies. That's the Schokbeton prefabricated housing and then the GNCC building project. And I'll conclude by pointing out the ubiquitous architecture, hybrid foreign design, and the form of statehood that is created. Next slide, please. All right, so I would start with a quote that was in the Daily Graphic in 1954. It says that all sorts of plans have been introduced since the so-called crusade to Holland, but one stubborn fact remains: the buildings intended to ease the sufferings of our people have yet to be built. This was the criticism Kwame Nkrumah, the leader of the Convention People's Party and first president of Ghana, received for his unsuccessful attempt at addressing the housing situation in the new state, and for his decision to adopt the prefabricated Dutch housing method. Apparently, prefabricated housing had been touted as a quick way of producing housing for the teeming masses who were daily trooping to the urban centers. So public housing became an important objective during the years that I mentioned as the transitional and early independence years, due to three political agendas. That's the Africanization agenda, industrialization agenda, and then modernization agenda. Africanization mainly focused on the fact that African senior officials were required to occupy top positions or top management positions in government. And with that position, they were also required to live in government bungalows. Then there's also the industrialization agenda, which led to the establishment of pioneer companies. And with that also resulted in the migration of workers from rural areas to urban centers where the pioneer industries were established. And all these workers needed to be accommodated. And then the third agenda was also the modernization agenda, where it was, the government felt that the standard of housing needed to be improved to come to an international level. And so a lot of housing programs began. All these housing projects demanded a lot of funding, but then the country was not really in a position to fund all these projects. And so they had to fall on foreign assistance. In terms of loans, so they took a lot of loans, and then also technical assistance, because they were modernist ideas, modernist designs, and our people did not have the skill yet. So they had to fall on foreigners for technical assistance. And then there was, these projects also came with the introduction of cement-based material as compared to our earth-based material for the construction of traditional buildings. And then the technology and as well as the housing policies, all of them we had to borrow them from their foreign partners. So I state in this research that, or I argue in this research that the new state sense of responsibility for housing the population and fulfilling the three political agendas made it dependent in new ways on foreign actors, thereby recreating and reimagining its dependency, and at the same time showcasing the tension between independent state building and then also dependence on house building. So then it led to a disconnect. Next slide, please. So modernist planning in Ghana mainly resulted in the redesign of human settlements and also replanning of human settlements, as well as redesign of some of the state buildings. And modernist ideas or modernist planning ideas were touted as something that could showcase the country, to let the people know that the country has come of age, Ghana has come of age. And so the plans were ambitious and they were also optimistic. And they created, this resulted in a false belief in the transformative potentials of state-led massive modernist projects. According to Abubakar and Duan, they have stated that modernist planning was based on grand plans and programs, which were implemented using top-down approaches and creating some kind of planning that left out the traditional ideas, the traditional way of constructing our houses, and even the traditional skills that we had. So this led to a major contradiction between the idea of a national style based on tradition and then the revolutionary principles of the new nation building. Yet, what could Ghana do at that time? Because Ghana was the first country to become independence in Africa. And so they did not really have any other alternative, another country to look up to. And so they had to fall on the Europeans or the West for ideas. Next slide, please. So in the formation of a new state, here I specifically refer to the first president, Kwame Nkrumah. He needed a technological and scientific great leap so that he would be able to create a new and thoroughly modern state, all in a bid to escape the grip of colonialism. So it's to break the hold of colonialism on Ghana. Yet we still went back to the foreign partners, because as I stated earlier, we didn't really have a lot of African examples that we could look up to. And so we went back to the Western partners. And by so doing, and that was also part of their strategy. In fact, it was part of Nkrumah's tactical action, because his tactical action was to go and then take ideas from the West if the need arises. So efficient, according to Nkrumah, said efficient government administrative and technical personnel will be recruited from abroad if the need arises. And that also informed Ghana's foreign policy at that time. And it was premised on the fact that the government did not intend to follow a neutral policy, but to preserve its independence. So at the same time, picking ideas from the West, international ideas, at the same time, trying to maintain Ghana's independence. So the foreign policy had implication on the building industry in terms of the construction technology that was introduced, the architectural designs, the kind of building materials used, the cost of construction, and even the pace of production. So I talk about the cost of construction because then these buildings were were cement based and then had metal roofing sheets. All these were imported, and the import increased the cost of construction. The import also affected the pace of production. So this was the situation at that time. Next slide, please. So these two pictures show the impact of foreign designs and technology on housing production. The story building is a house located in one of the regional capitals in Ghana, that's in Koforidua, built by one of the rich cocoa farmers in the 1960s, thereabout, 50s and 60s. And when you look at the building, it tells you, although it's a family house, although it is a family house that is intended to accommodate the members of the extended family, it had been modernized or appropriated or redesigned to still incorporate some of the ideas from the European architecture or architectures that were of the buildings that were being constructed locally. So we have the Rage houses and all those houses. And so this building tried to incorporate some of the designs in it in terms of the roofing style, showing the hip roof, in terms of the columns, and then even the story level. All these were part of the impact of the foreign designs and technology on our housing production. On the other picture, it's a model of an experimental building that was constructed by the Forestry Commission in Cote, another suburban place in Ghana. And this was to showcase or to demonstrate to the people that we could use our earth-based material, but then produce or compact them into bricks and then use them in construction. And for two reasons, this would be cheaper because the materials were locally assessed, and then it will also provide labor or work for the masses of people that are in Ghana. Next slide, please. So I mentioned that I was going to use two housing programs to illustrate Ghana's dependence on foreign ideas or foreign partnership. And that also had an implication on the way our statehood were reimagined or recreated. So the Schokbeton prefabricated housing, which was promoted by the Dutch, it was touted as one of the strategies that would quickly address the housing situation that Ghana found itself in during that period, during the early transitional years, because it had superior structural strength, and then it was also affordable, and you could construct it quickly. There's rapid erection of these houses. So then the new housing that was produced at that time, the new design that was what came up at that time had about 32 different components, prefabricated components. And then the people complained that it was just too much for them to build and to produce all these components and assemble them to have it, to construct a house. And so it was reduced to 12 components, and with an anticipated cost reduction of about 15%. However, the condition was that the designs were to be sent to Holland for approval. And if given, then the component parts would be produced over there and shipped to Gold Coast or Ghana. So the desire to adopt international architectural style by seeking approval from Holland, to me, was a contradiction to Ghana's state realization and recognition agenda. So while the country wanted to boldly proclaim its independence and self-identity, it was also quick to imbibe foreign ideas. And that was all in the bid to address the infant state that the country found itself in. Unfortunately, the Schokbeton housing program was not successful. And by 1954, the whole program was suspended because it was quite expensive. And the UN Technical Mission on Housing had advised the government at that time to suspend such a program and instead come up with 4 programs. But for the lack of time, I can't really explain or talk more about those programs. But only 64 out of the estimated almost 1,700 housing units were completed by 1954. Next slide, please. The second example is the GNCC Corporation or Ghana Housing Corporation building project. So even after 1957, prior to 1957 was when Ghana gained independence. So prior to the independence and right after the independence, the housing demand was so high that workers were demanding housing. If you read the dailies at that time, a lot of editorials and a lot of comments were written in the newspapers asking government to act and build for workers. So the GNCC was established in 1956 and was tasked to produce or to build about 800 houses and also to establish a housing research bureau. However, what is so interesting is that the GNCC itself depended heavily on foreign workforce. So we had a number of British architects working in these in this organization. And so the ideas that they were even churning out were more of foreign designs. If you look at the plan that I have attached, it's totally different from even the metamorphosed traditional family house that I showed you in the picture earlier. This was completely a nuclear family house. For two reasons, it was quite expensive to construct this building, this kind of building. And then, as I mentioned earlier, the production of such buildings were also slow. So eventually, it didn't really address the housing need as much as the government would have hoped it did. So such dependence influenced the kind of architecture produced. And Modestus Apalu was a parliamentarian between 1950 and 1954, commented that the foreign expert advice on housing was not incorporating the use of local building materials and local builders, often leading to expensive construction. And so Kodia, who was a government engineer, suggested that burnt bricks and tiles could be used in constructing houses because it was appropriate for the tropical weather, and also because the building materials could be accessed locally. So in conclusion, next slide, please. Next slide, please. Yeah. So in conclusion, yes, Sunil, can I have the last slide? So in conclusion, having gained independence, So in conclusion, having gained independence, the leaders of the country wanted to showcase the new and modern Ghana and demonstrate to the population that Ghana could support itself and solve its own problems. The development agenda was based on economic and social development for state building and higher standards as the country strode towards modernity, in line with an approach then trending in the West. So Nkrumah's response to the colonial regulation of architectural space reflected a distinctive imagining of modernism, a vision which... Hello?
Yes.
Okay. So Nkrumah's response to the colonial regulation of architectural space reflected a distinctive imagining of modernism. And Ghana's house building during the post-colonial period also exposed broader tensions between state building and independence. Nkrumah was looking for public housing projects that would lead to rapid industrialization for his country. Yet his continuous engagements with international partners also introduced an influential and ubiquitous architecture rooted in a complex hybrid of foreign ideas and styles. This observation actually is contrary to what had been envisioned in the past, because it was envisioned that although the Westerners were involved in Ghana's house building project, Ghana would come out and then develop its own style. It is still quite subjective. So in conclusion, Ghana's foreign policy and dependence on international relations for independent state building introduced neo-colonialism and defined a particular form of statehood that is very evident in post-colonial architecture and public housing development. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the excellent presentation. Also, you took the time of the second speaker. So,
Sorry.
So our second speakers are Julia Gallagher and Ariane Ndjore. Julia is a professor of African politics at SOAS University of London. Her research uses architecture as a way to understand citizens' readings of statehood. Ariane is in the final stage of a PhD in communication for development at Félix Houphouët-Boigny University in Abidjan. Her research explores the promotion of university research in Côte d'Ivoire and its impact on the community. The title of the presentation today is What Society Makes of the State, Reading Côte d'Ivoire's Public Architecture. Over to you, Julia.
Thank you very much. I'm going to deliver the paper, and my co-author, Ariane, is also online and may feel moved to chip in with comments and answers to questions during the question and answer session. So our paper explores how citizens in Abidjan think about the state, which we gleaned through from conversations about state buildings, including iconic examples like the presidential palaces, the assembly, the basilica, and also mundane state buildings like hospitals, police stations, and schools. And these were described during face group discussions with ordinary people living and working in Abidjan, which we conducted in a variety of languages, but between us. We did this last year. So our starting point draws on, or the starting point of the paper at the moment draws on Susan Vogel's work on Wole art. And Vogel argues that art is powerful in part because of what the artist puts into it, but also it's powerful for what people looking at it or experiencing it put into it. So the tangible, visible content is provided by the artist, but is perhaps not as important or is equally as important as the imagined invisible content projected onto it by the viewer. So yes, state buildings, materials, position and function are all created by state elites, but actually the way citizens understand and imagine them gives them substantial amounts of power. Our method, we held the face groups with a variety of groups, different religious groups, people in different forms of employment. To get a social mix, we had men and women in roughly equal numbers, and we tried our best to also to get a range of age groups to sort of try and get a kind of diverse mixture. But I have to say that we don't claim that this is meant to be a representative sample. This is a series of conversations with different people living around Abidjan and throwing up ideas about these buildings and the state. And in the focus groups, we asked members of the group to come up with a list of Côte d'Ivoire's most important questions. Most important public buildings. And so there was some discussion at the beginning of each group about what were the most important buildings. And then we asked them to start to begin to describe the buildings that they'd chosen. Now, on the whole, people were a little bit flummoxed to start with by this question and this idea. But once they started thinking and discussing, they had loads of ideas. As one student in one of the groups put it, he said, when we talk about architecture, we talk about the way we think, which I think is a very nice encapsulation of what we were trying to get at. So we were particularly struck during these discussions by descriptions of the beauty and the ugliness of the buildings. Can I move on to the next slide, please? This is a slide I'll come to describing it a little bit in a minute. Beauty emerged pretty much immediately during these discussions, and beauty of these buildings was described in idealized and rather vague terms about buildings that were either seen from afar or imagined. This building is in Abidjan, so most of the people, all the people that we spoke to had seen this building, but other buildings that we'll come on to, they hadn't actually seen because they were in Yamoussoukro, which is quite a long distance. Beauty was very closely associated in the descriptions to ideas of order and structure. And Côte d'Ivoire has some really amazingly impressive and beautiful buildings. The city administrative, which is this one, is where many of the government departments are housed. Can you move on to the next slide? The next slide is of one of the presidential palaces. This one is in Yamoussoukro, on the edge of the famous Crocodile Lake. Can you move on to the next slide? And this is the famous basilica, which is reputed to be the largest Catholic church in the world. And there are many other examples. So people came to describe these buildings, and they described them with words like jewels, icons, masterpieces. They were said to be chic. They were described as works of art. They were perfect. They were shining. They often used abstract terms, or terms that were sort of difficult to pin down, like these, that appeared to float free from political content or even actually practical purpose. So very little discussion was entered into about what happens inside these buildings or what they're actually for. People focused on their exceptionalism, so the largest or the most visited or the most beautiful, in particular in the rest of West Africa. So Côte d'Ivoire has buildings that the rest of West Africa envies, and comparable only possibly to European buildings. But in fact, of course, this particular building, the Basilica, is supposed to be bigger than St. Paul's in Rome. The buildings also, in many discussions, seem to possess magical properties. So, for example, one of Houphouët-Boigny's sort of iconic hospitals is supposed to cure you as soon as you enter into it. The architecture itself cures you, makes you better. His Peace Foundation, also in Yamoussoukro, automatically just calms down your temper, makes you feel serene as soon as you enter into it. It's the power of the architecture. So there's something quite sort of mystical about this. And also that their origins, often these origins of these remarkable buildings, suggest other worlds. So people often pointed to the fact that they're built by the French or by the Italians. Sometimes they're described as being built by masks or by geniuses, the otherworldly kind of origins. And Houphouët-Boigny himself, the founding president who built all of these buildings or commissioned them, is kind of connected to his mystique of being a genius and certainly not normal, an extraordinary man. So overall, the beauty of the buildings was described as seen from a distance. It was idealized and represented extraordinary power, order, and beauty. Can you move on to the next slide, please? Gradually, as the discussions continued, this is a picture of the Basilica seen from a street in Yamoussoukro, descriptions of underlying ugliness emerged. So ugliness was much more often encountered in visceral ways, heavily mixed up with disorder or even chaos. Ugliness was often connected to mundane buildings that people encountered from the inside. So in these buildings, such as schools and hospitals and so on, there's much more confusion. People described how they got lost. They couldn't find their way around. And we had descriptions such as they're too small, they're squashed. You hear, but you cannot see. Somebody described some of the buildings as soft, so that even with a small wind, everything flies away. They're flimsy. Example, schools are so small that students are stuck tight, and when it's like that, it's complicated. Hospitals are dirty and make you feel sick, apart from the iconic Houphouët-Boigny one. Hospitals, when you go in there, you feel like you're going to die, even if you're not ill. The prison is humiliating. It's not pretty to see. Police stations are degraded, lacking hygiene and order, and so on. So ugliness is very much experienced through the haptic senses. So it's smelled and touched and heard rather than seen. And the impressions are very much of disorder, neglect, ruin, and even terror. Ugliness also emerged in discussions about the beautiful, iconic buildings in relation to ideas of what might actually be inside them, where people don't see and haven't been, but what they've heard or imagined. Ugliness sometimes seems to be seeping out or threatening to overwhelm these buildings. So buildings are, for example, dying, falling apart, slackening with areas that ooze. They have brush all over the place. The paint is gone. There's no more shine. And there are rumours of hauntings and witchcraft. One very poignant example that people pointed to was the idea that some of the migrant labourers who came to Côte d'Ivoire to build these buildings and died on the construction sites are buried in their foundations. And there's this sort of idea about these hauntings. Can I have the next slide, please? This is the Peace Foundation in Yamoussoukro. So we begin in the paper to build this into an aesthetic reading of the state, using the ways in which people describe beauty and ugliness to explore their ideas about the state. The state's beauty is idealized, and I think, or we think, politically thin. It's distant, it's untouchable. Although it's apparently about order, it's as though the order is to be seen but not touched. The state's ugliness is possibly much more immersive, much more absorbed into people's bodies, in fact, through smell and sound and feeling. And through that, it seems to express disorder and ugliness. We think that this deeply buried, hidden from sight ugliness can seem dangerous to the state because its beauty is perhaps so fragile and so distant. And we suggest that this fragile beauty and the anxiety that it might be overwhelmed by ugliness are what make the people we talk to tend to keep the beautiful and the ugly aspects of the buildings quite separate from each other. Now the final slide, please. Go back to the administrative in Abidjan. So finally, we use this idea of the state, all these ideas, to begin to question two avowedly aesthetic theories of African statehood, Achille Mbembe's and Jean-François Bayard's. Mbembe describes only disorder and ugliness in the post-colony. There's no beauty or order in his description. And we think, no, in Côte d'Ivoire, the beauty of the state is apparent and is important, providing a sense of an ideal order, even if it is idealized and distant, and as we point out, fragile. Bayard does describe two levels, the pays légal, the beautiful, ordered and artificial part of the state, and the pays réel, the more convoluted, disordered part of the state. But for Bayard's state, order is outwardly projected to the outside world, to the donors, and only disorder consumed domestically. And we think that in the case of Côte d'Ivoire, no, beauty and ugliness are both part of the domestic state-society relationship. So to conclude, we think that treating buildings as the body of the state is a productive way to discern citizens' ideas of statehood, and that's what we're trying to sort of work out a way of doing. We see fragile beauty and visceral ugliness revealed in descriptions by people living in Abidjan. The first far away and the other up close, almost physically absorbed. And that finally together, these define the state in a way that challenges existing state theories that underplay the importance of a state ideal for African citizens and a relationship between beauty and ugliness. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Julie. Our next speaker is Tonderai Koschke. Tonderai is a Zimbabwean architect currently practicing in Zurich, Switzerland. Her research interest is in the relationship between commercial enterprises and post-colonial identity. The title of her presentation today is on colonial legacies, race and shopping, aspiration and division in a Zimbabwean mall. Over to you, Tonde.
Thank you for that introduction, Daniel. As Daniel mentioned, the chapter I'm going to present is entitled Colonial Legacies, Race and Shopping, Aspiration and Division in a Zimbabwean Mall. So the context of the chapter and the mall in question is Harare, the capital of Zimbabwe, which was formerly known as Rhodesia under British colonial rule. And the spatial system in Harare was designed to facilitate a racial divide in the city, which has today at least partially evolved into a class divide. It is a very physical divide along a north-south axis, and the northern suburbs, which were originally built as settler residential housing, are today inhabited by the wealthier members of Harare society. So in one of the very prominent suburbs in the northern part of the city called Borodale, we find the mall which we're going to discuss called Sam Levy's Village. Now there is a lot of research on colonial architecture and malls, which exists because of how consumption has infiltrated public space and come to characterize our built environment. There's also some literature on consumption in the global south. However, there is a lack of specific work on permanent commercial architecture in this context. Although I find this would be very important, particularly in places like Harare, where there's a lack of other public spaces for social interactions between different groups of society. So one of the ways in which I examine the mall in the chapter is in whether it fulfills the function of an inclusive place where social interaction between different groups of society can take place. May I have the next slide, please? So what is particular about Sam Levy's village, as you can maybe already gather from the picture with the replica of the Big Ben in it, is that it was designed according to a Little England theme. Now, the mall was one of the first malls to be built in Harare just around 10 years after independence from what had been British colonial rule. And the theme, therefore, raises questions about who the target group for the mall was when it was built. So my main argument in the paper, and may I have the next slide, please? Yeah, my main argument in the paper is that the symbolism used in the design of the mall sells an idea of Britishness that is packaged for consumption in order to reflect both elitism and whiteness, eliteness and whiteness. The mall has been extremely successful through the various stages of economic strife that Zimbabwe has experienced in recent years. And this, I think, reflects the resonance that certain groups of the public have with the theme of the mall. So I also argue that the architecture of the mall actively excludes people who are not a part of this group and thereby creates an asylum for people who are seeking racial and class exclusivity. So one way in which I illustrate this is by observing the visitors to the mall. So I use some statistics on visitors in various cafes and parts of the mall. But I also look at how many people who arrive from lower density areas at a mini bus stop that's just outside the mall arrive and enter the mall to work there. But once they do so, rather than becoming active participants in the space, become almost like a part of the architecture because they are mostly ignored by visitors, but serve to contribute to the atmosphere of safety in the mall, which in the example, which you can see in the picture of the security guard. So in all my observations, the workers in these lower level jobs inside the mall were Black, and this serves to also reinforce the image of colonial hierarchy, which is observable in the mall. And I'm particularly interested in how the architecture of the mall facilitates and cements this imagery. So one method I identify this by is described in a seminal text on architectural symbolism called Learning from Las Vegas by Venturi, Scott, and Izanor. And the method is by creating the quality of being in an oasis in a perhaps hostile environment. So the architecture, when using this method, puts a negative light on the local environment, so in this case, the city, by closing itself off from the local environment completely. And this is particularly unusual in the case of commercial architecture, because there are various other examples which show that usually at least one face of the buildings which faces the outside, so usually the road along which potential customers pass, is open and inviting and already reflects the architecture of the mall. But in the case of the village, we have a central walkway with shop houses on both sides facing the interior of the mall, and the outside of the structure is completely neglected. It's wrapped around by a parking lot, a fence, and a ditch. And so the structure is basically completely closed off from the environment. Next slide, please. So I use a mall that is just next to Sam Levy's village, which is the Village Walk. For comparison, in terms of the architecture, as you can see in the picture, although it's a U-shaped mall which has more of an interior feel in parts of it, the outside of the mall, which faces the main streets, still reflects through signage and so on the architecture of the mall. I also then compare the patronage of this mall and do find that the crowd is more racially and class diverse in this mall. So finally, I look at current developments at Sam Levy's village. Next slide, please. Here we see a new part of the mall, which has been extended in recent years. And the village extension already shows a kind of breaking away from the rigid order of the original structure of the themed mall. And this seems to respond to public opinion, which was expressed in several interviews I held, which considered the original structure to be old-fashioned now. And this is interesting because the generic architecture, for example, the village walk, which they consider to be more modern, actually predates the kind of architecture of the open-air themed mall, which we have in the original structure. So this appears to reflect a change in public opinion and in the way they interact with the structure of the mall. So this is actually an area I would like to develop the chapter a little bit further in, to see how current developments in the mall reflect the shifting power dynamics in Zimbabwe in more recent years. However, the conclusion of my findings so far is that the main structure of Sam Levy's village fails to function as a place for social interaction between different groups of society in Harare, but in fact, through its exclusionary architecture, actually cements the social divisions in this post-colonial context. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tondi. Our next speaker is Mari Gibert. Mari is an independent scholar based in Nairobi, Kenya. Her PhD from SOAS, University of London, and postdoctoral research focused on Africa's international relations. Her topic of presentation today is Public Spaces, Public Goods, Reinventing Nairobi's Public Libraries. Over to you, Mari.
Thanks, Daniel. So I've been looking at Nairobi's public libraries and the work that a civil society organization called Book Monk has been doing to try and restore these libraries and reinvent them. So as you'll see, I mean, the three libraries in question were built at three different important moments in Nairobi's history, and I'll come back to that. And Book Monk, in doing this restorative work, is what we would call a service delivery organization. And I came across a paper by Jacob Mwati-Mati, who looks at civil society organizations in Kenya and South Africa. And he describes these organizations, these service delivery organizations, as both pacifying and stabilizing agents that are effectively perpetuating a certain status quo, a certain domination of market forces, but also as agents of social creativity. And I'm going to try and show that this really fits Book Monk, and it's really what it's doing. And it does so in three areas, in three sort of big debates. And I'd contend that some of these debates are more explicit than others. So the three areas are, what do we do with Kenya's and Nairobi's history and past, and in particular the colonial past? The second one is, what do we want libraries, public spaces such as libraries, to look like in a city that is fast changing like Nairobi? And then the third area is, how do we get the state, the market, and civil society to work together? How do we understand the way they work together in a city like Nairobi? So next slide, please, Sunil. So this is the main central library called the Macmillan Library, and this is the oldest one in Nairobi. It was inaugurated in 1931, and you can obviously see the very colonial dimension of that library, both outside and inside. And this is really the most iconic one where this colonial past is most visible. The two other libraries I'm going to talk about, and we'll see pictures of them later on. One was built in the 1940s as part of a broader neighborhood that was built to house African laborers in the neighborhood of Kaloleni. And then the last one was built in Makadara, another poorer area of Nairobi, in the 1970s, so at the time of independence. Now, one of the big issues for Book Bank, so this civil society organization that was founded by two book enthusiasts, as they call themselves, so women who had worked in publishing companies. Of course, one of the big debates, and that's really the debate that they explicitly acknowledge and that, you know, they completely embrace, was what do we do with this history, and to what extent do we reinvent these libraries, to what extent do we transform them? And their answer is very clearly, we need to keep the walls, we need to keep the architecture, but we're going to transform the contents, and we're going to really question the contents. And I would argue that this is very much something in line with the way most Kenyans think of Kenya's colonial past. So there is a sort of, a lot of Kenyans are accustomed to live with that colonial past. There is, you know, in particular, this very romanticized safari culture that very much plays with some of the cliches of Kenya's colonial past. And there's lots of examples of this sort of hybridity of trying to, you know, both respect the past and maintain this colonial past, but also reinvent a different future. And interestingly, there's a very quite famous rapper, Kenyan rapper Mutoni Drummer Queen, who shot a video clip quite recently, a few months ago, in this Macmillan Memorial Library for her song Power. And it really encapsulates this. So it's shot in the library, and it acknowledges, it talks about the torture chambers that, you know, were quite famous under the post-independence authoritarian regimes. But it's also talking about how women need to become more powerful and become loud and louder. So very much encapsulates this. Let's talk about let's acknowledge the past, but let's build a different future. So this is really what Book Bank has been trying to do, and the idea is to then decolonize the books and the contents of the libraries. So they've set out to do a full inventory of the libraries and to effectively get rid of most of the books and to buy new books and get in more African authors and also African female authors. And this has been done in the Kaloleni Library, and we can go to the next slide, please, Sonia. Yeah, so this is the Kaloleni Library, and so the black and white pictures are from before, and the color pictures are the results. So the restoration was completed in June of this year, and you can see from the picture showing the restoration from outside that, you know, they've really kept the outside appearance of the library, but you can see that inside it's changed quite dramatically. And the idea has been to make it a much more child-friendly library with lots of colors and bring in some much more modern furniture inside. And they've also launched a crowdfunding initiative effectively to buy books and kept their promise to Africanize the contents. And amongst the books that you could find on the wish list, you had, you know, great African authors like Chinua Achebe, But you also had quite a lot of Kenya youth books, Kenya published youth books. And I kind of think that raises the issue a little bit of to what extent can you have both this Africanization and keep also high quality books, because some of these books that for youth in particular published in Kenya, I would contend are not necessarily the greatest quality books that you could find. I mean, there's an increasingly rich African literature that is not necessarily, sadly, published in Africa. And I think there's maybe a debate to be had there about, to what extent all the books should be specifically published in Kenya. So that's for this tension between history and future. In the second part, and we can go to the next slide. The other issue is, of course, and this is something that is less acknowledged or less explicitly acknowledged by BookBank, but the second issue is, of course, these libraries are situated in an urban setting and in a very changing urban setting that is Nairobi. And the big question is, what kind of public service can libraries offer in that kind of environment? And I think BookBank has seized on quite a lot of things. They know and they understand that libraries can be tranquil refugees from, this hustle and bustle of the city. And that's what most library users have used the libraries for. They haven't been coming to these libraries for the contents, that was completely out of date, but really to just sit down and work in a quiet environment. So there's certainly a recognition of that by BookBank, and that's something they want to keep. And in particular, they have a project called Hepad Jam Project, where they would like to keep the libraries open later in the evening so that people can actually delay leaving the city until the traffic jams are over. So they can actually sit down, work a bit at the library, and then go back home once the traffic jams are over. But they've also tried to perpetuate a certain tradition of using libraries to hold events. And this is something that we see a lot in many African countries, where libraries are used to host educational, political, community events. And this is something they have tried to do, but not necessarily completely with the same spirit. So certainly they've used the libraries to host events for the community, for children. So they've been showing films, for example. They've also had a partnership with an optician company to offer eye tests to people. But they've also used the libraries to invite in academics and artists and other civil society organizations, so maybe more elite type events, if we can call them in that way. And then finally, in a very prosaic way, BookBank has also used the libraries to just raise funds, so to attract potential donors, to showcase their work, and to try and raise further funds for other projects. So effectively, there's a sort of part reinvention, part perpetuating traditions. One of the issues maybe is to what extent they've really been able to offer an interclass mix. Most of the events, I would say, were directed to certain social classes and not necessarily to trying and mix these social classes together. Next slide, please. So the third area where I think there's an interesting debate going on, and that I think BookBank's work on these libraries really illustrates quite clearly, is where are the limits between state and civil society and market in Kenya, and where do we situate BookBank's work, but also where do we situate the kind of public service that public libraries might be able to offer. And this is a debate that is ongoing in Kenya, and that is very, very important in Kenya, and notably at the local level in Kenya, where people are disaffected with what local government or the national government are doing, and they want better public service, but it's not always clear who they expect to deliver that public service. And to what extent they want this to be a state-only objective, or whether they're happy for civil society and private actors to step in. And I would say Book Bank really encapsulates this debate and these tensions. And again, I think they do so quite implicitly, and they wouldn't necessarily acknowledge it in that way. So on the one hand, they've got an agreement with the Nairobi county government to take care of the 3 libraries for 5 years. And they say that they've been working with the county government, that nothing can be done without the authorization of the county government. So on paper and in the discourse, there's a very strong respect for the authority of the government. But on the other hand, there seems to be actually little ownership by the county government, and little visibility of the librarians, because we still have librarians employed by the Nairobi county government who work in these libraries, and also little librarian expertise used in what Book Bank is doing. So the work done by Book Bank is done by its own staff who are not trained in librarianship. And that includes the inventory. So that really raises quite a lot of question about expertise and ownership. There's also really tensions or issues raised about the sort of boundaries between the civil society organization and the private sector. One is that they really use private sector strategy in everything they're doing. They've got an extremely sophisticated communication strategy and marketing strategy for a very small civil society organization. It's quite interesting to see. So very much a sort of private sector orientated way of doing things that. Yeah, is more private sector than civil society, I would say. And another recent event that kind of interrogates this relationship is one of the 2 founders published her own book with a publishing company that she founded and that she has called Bunk Books. So she's taken the same 2 words and just inverted them. And this Bunk Book publishing company is linked to Book Bank, the civil society organization, which again interrogates a little bit these boundaries and is quite interesting. So to conclude on all of that, I would say that the Nairobi's public libraries are the site of some interesting tensions and an interesting debate. Again, more or less explicit debate. Around history, around urban development, and around the place of the state and civil society. And that Book Bank is not really questioning the status quo and the sort of de facto way the different actors are finding their own space, but they have certainly put a lot of energy into recreating things, and they have as such acted as agents of social creativity and trying to reinvent these libraries and how they are going to be used. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mari, and everyone for the excellent presentations. Now I'm going to open up the floor for the audience to ask questions. So you can ask questions by raising your hands or typing a message on the chat box. Questions?
I think Jo's got her hand up and Laura.
Okay, so Jo, do you want to go first?
Yeah, thank you for those really interesting presentations. I've got one question for everyone. So Irene, one of the things that struck me from your really interesting presentation was, I was wondering to what extent part of the the house building agenda and state building agenda that you're describing involve trying to create new kinds of citizens by trying to create new kinds of homes. I know you described one of them as sort of breaking apart traditional Ghanaian family structures and being much more about the nuclear family. And I just wondered if that effort was something, part of some change that maybe the Ghanaian state independence was trying to create, sort of social engineering through the house building projects, or whether it was just through the foreign importation of those ideas. Julia, one of the things I was thinking when I was looking at your presentation was how quiet your photos were, actually. I'd never really noticed how isolated these buildings are from the kind of noise and hustle and bustle of a typical capital city or a major urban centre anywhere. I just wondered, was that siting, is that deliberate? Has there been encroachment around those buildings, or have those buildings been some of the beauty that they evoke? Do you think that comes from how the rest of the city and normal life has kind of been kept very at arm's length? Tondi, one of the things that I thought was really interesting, and again struck me from one of your photos, the little Harrods photo, was how you were saying that people are sort of, the people that work in Sam Levy's mall have kind of been subsumed into the architecture. And I just wondered if you could talk a bit more about that, because I thought that was a really interesting idea that would be good to hear more about that. And Marie, yeah, I think it would be really interesting to know a bit more about, you were sort of hinting at it at the end there, the sort of maybe the class nature of Book Bunk and the civil society initiative. Is it a very middle class exclusive kind of project? Is that like whose decolonization agenda, whose public service, who's benefiting from these libraries, would you say? Yeah, that's it for me.
Okay, there are two questions from David. Before I read them out, if Laura wants to ask a question that you have, Laura.
I'm going to try this. I've literally just been interrupted at the point where I have to come off mute. So hopefully my son won't chime in too much. I had two questions, really. Oh, have you made a... Yes, I have. It's fine, darling. So I have one question for Irene, which is the narrative that you're giving about the kind of the failings of these kind of modernist housing projects. I wondered how much that links to kind of broader trends of the failings of modernist housing projects in the West and elsewhere as well, right? So this same era of modernist housing projects in Ghana that you're kind of talking about, you've also got kind of mass housing projects in the West and India and other places, right, that actually also don't seem to fully work. So I'm wondering about the Ghanaian-ness of this story, and I think you've kind of talked about this a bit, but how it kind of links to kind of broader problems with that kind of approach, I suppose. And then I just had a quick question for Tondi, which was two elements. One, which is a really quick question, which was kind of a methodological question, because you talk about there being a lack of racial variation in the people who are coming in, but also about class. And I wondered how you worked out that, right? Does that make sense? Is this through interviews that you've done with people who were there? And how are you working out class, if that makes any sense? The other question I had was about backstage areas and if I can use that term, and how different the architecture is behind the back of these buildings, which you say you can see because you kind of approach them from the back and then you kind of go into this oasis, and what that looks like that's quite different, and whether that difference is and how that kind of plays out with the Little England. Does that make sense? Is it kind of the same but kind of maybe slightly less ornate as you might expect for a background area, or are there things that kind of come out from that? And I just had a question about that.
Thank you, Laura. There are two questions from David. One is to all presenters. but especially to Julia. He says the meanings people attach to buildings could be influenced by their social coordinates, such as gender, education status, political affiliations, ethnic origin, if applicable, social class. Have you treated the nexus between these variables and the meanings / views people attach to the architecture / buildings? The second question is to Irene. Do you think that foreign architecture / housing styles erode self-identity? I raise these questions because it is not uncommon to see contention on the locally designed based on indigenous wisdom, historical buildings / architecture designs in multicultural / ethnic / lingual African countries. These are historical architectural heritages which are still points of public debate and even conflict in different parts of the continent and beyond. So I'm going to give a chance for speakers to answer these questions, and we'll move on to the second round of questions. So Irene, do you want to start?
Okay, thank you, Joe, for the first question, which was to examine the extent to which power dynamics is reflected in the state building and nation building. I hope I got it right, because I was just interrupted by, disturbed by someone just at that time. Anyway, yes, so from my presentation, from my research, I realized that there is a contention. So there is actually a tension between or maybe let me say there was a tension between the state building agenda and then the nation building agenda. So state building agenda at that time was to showcase that Ghana had come of age, Ghana was independent, Ghana could manage its own affairs. And therefore, we were ready to use our house and our modernist approaches and all those things to showcase what Ghana could achieve. At the same time, we also, I also noticed from the research that there was a bit of, there was also the fact that we didn't really have the resources to be able to achieve all that we desired in terms of showcasing how Ghana should look like. Although some projects were implemented, like the Akosombo Dam and all that, we had to depend on foreign aid. So we went in for loans, we went in for all these things. So it created a bit of tension. And getting to the latter part of Nkrumah's reign, he received a lot of criticism that he was always running to the foreign partners for aid, and therefore Nkrumah could not assert himself, could not exercise agency, and so he lost his agency. If I should put it that way, I should put it bluntly, that Nkrumah lost his agency. So then there was that contention. Or there was that tension between the state building agenda to showcase that Ghana was independent, and then meanwhile, these house building or public house building programs were totally not dependent in terms of foreign aid and other things. And then the second one, the second question is also about failures of the modernist mass housing project. With the issue of failures of the mass housing project, I think I know a little bit about the Netherlands situation where their mass housing project failed because they had these huge projects, huge agenda, and then they could not really maintain those buildings. Or it got to a time that in the 90s or early 2000s, people were not really occupying those buildings. And so they had to pull it down and then subdivide it and have these little projects. In the case of Ghana, I would say that we were not even able to achieve much in terms of the mass housing project. We were not able to construct. We didn't really have, we started a project and then few houses are constructed and then the whole project is abandoned, just like the Schokbeton case. So it was anticipated that about 1,600 and something, almost over 1,600 houses should be built. Only 64 were constructed. In the case of the national GNCC, about 800 houses were projected to be built, and yet they couldn't achieve the set target. And that has been the trend in terms of the mass housing projects. And even now, it's still going on. And we have low-income houses that are being constructed these times, and yet we haven't managed to achieve the set target. So that is something that I think that is the difference between the Western approach or the Western failure of mass housing and then the Ghana approach. Then, yes, I read quite a number of comments, I think a lengthy comment about the loss of the architectural designs in multicultural, ethnic, lingual African countries. Let me let another person take over whilst I come back and then respond to this question, because I have to read thoroughly and then get what he's asking. Daniel.
Yeah, thank you. Julia, there are several questions for you. So
I've got two questions. So Joe, the quiet, isolated buildings. The comments I'm making are obviously as a visitor to Abidjan and Côte d'Ivoire. I did visit both Abidjan and Yamoussoukro, and I took these photographs. And these are the ways that I saw them. I think Ariane may have a slightly different perspective, being a local. So she might want to come in on this and present a rather different answer. But to me, the buildings seem to be extremely deliberately monumental. This is part of the kind of very grand image of the state. The basilica takes a good 15, 20 minutes to walk to from the gate. I was thinking about a lot of the buildings are definitely to be viewed. So the administrative is viewed from all over Plateau, which is the business district of Abidjan. You can't get very close to them. So those are the buildings that are most in the centre of the city, but there's a wall around them and you can look down, but you can't get in. And there's a kind of sense of looking at these buildings. And sometimes from across the water, the whole of this district plateau of Abidjan is like a kind of, it is like a creation of a jewel. It's a kind of magic place of utter beauty and monumentalism. There are also buildings like the presidential offices and palaces, which actually are not supposed to be looked at. They're so almost sort of sacred that you have this sort of, that they're hidden behind walls. So the one I showed you of Yamoussoukro, you can't take photographs any closer than I was early one morning when nobody was watching. And the idea is that they're not to be looked at too closely. The one in Abidjan is even more so. It's very heavily protected and you can't even see it. So I think there is a kind of a sense of a deliberate iconification of the state in these buildings. Dawit, your question about the methods and the people's different kinds of people coming from different walks of life, having different views about the buildings. I would just I think that's true, but I don't think our method would capture that, partly because we didn't set out to recruit a representative sample of people. And this also relates to the dynamics of focus groups, because when you get a group of people together, it's the way that the conversation develops. So it's not that most of the time, in fact, I think all of the time, people don't arrive with a particular thing that they want to say and a kind of sense of the topic. They come with a sort of freshly to this, and they start to think through the discussion. And so discussions can go in different directions. And then sometimes you get a dynamic in the group where, everybody gets quite competitive about how wonderful Côte d'Ivoire is and how the buildings are just so special. And then in others you get, there's a bit of a downer on the government, and you get much more sort of sense of the grime and the problems and some of the sort of the more ugliness of it. But on the whole, although I sort of thought that my impression was that some of the sort of less affluent groups were a bit more diffident about speaking about the buildings, and the more sort of highly educated or richer groups were more sort of confident about talking about the buildings. A lot of the terminology was very similar, so a lot of the descriptions of the buildings were similar. I mean, it was surprising to me that even groups of people that have worked in some of these buildings described them in this very kind of idealized, distant way. So I think that's what I have to say.
Ariane, if she's online, does she want to answer some of the questions, or?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Good morning, everyone. Excuse me for my language. I'm a French speaker, so I try to express myself in English. So don't pay attention to my mistake. According to our study with Professor Julia, what I can say is during the discussion with people who participate to the study, what I noticed is some people the opportunity to visit some places because of some situation. For example, for administrative purposes, if people have to go to just, for example, so this place is open to everyone. So for students, for example, if they have to pass an exam and prepare papers and everything, they need to go to justice. Or if you have a problem in justice, for example, you need to there. You be obliged, or you need to and respond to a problem. What I want to say about during the discussion, there is no, excuse me, I'm reading the question by Miss Jo. It's very building people attached to a building could be influenced by the social coordinates such as gender education statute. It depends. It depends because some people, as I told, some people visit some places because of political activities of the rule in the society. For example, if you have to go to church like Basilique Dame de la Paix, it is open to everyone. If you want to only visit, you can pay and you can go there and visit it. So for some places like dance, the people who visit them talk about a special feeling they are there. It seems it is special for them. What can I? According to the discussion, the people of the young people, most of the young people don't know the symbol or don't know quite well the history of the building, the last building. But all the people have, most of them have the history of the building. What can we? So, what the people of them, most of them talk about the management of building. How the state take care of these places and so on.
Thanks, Ariane. Thanks for adding that.
Thank you very much, Ariane and Julia. So, Tondi, if you want to answer questions.
Yes, thank you for those questions. So I'll start with the one from Joe, which interestingly does link a little bit to one of Laura's questions, because I found that in the literature about the architecture of consumption in general, the comparison of these malls or spaces for consumption to stages where people could act out their conspicuous consumption for other people to see was quite common. And I do find that the role of a lot of people, but especially I would say the security guards, came across. They came across very much like I would place them as extras on the set, because they didn't have a speaking role, in the sense that they were generally ignored by people and were sort of placed more. There were definitely, for example, in the village itself, more security guards than necessary, because when compared to other malls, they had much fewer security guards and also less conspicuous uniforms. So it does appear to me that the security guards were also put there not just for the sake of security, but also to create this kind of atmosphere and to emphasize the fact that this is a secure environment. And that also plays into this idea of the mall being an oasis in a hostile environment, because if you do have more security than necessary, that does kind of imply the lack of security in the area, which for the suburb, the northern suburb of Borrowdale, as I described it, is maybe not as necessary. And so going on to Laura's question about the backstage spaces, I find this a very apt analogy, because in some way, because the outside of the houses, which is actually the front towards the street, is completely neglected. It's used in a little bit for servicing. So you had the occasional, you can see it like boxes from cooler fans on the outside, but no posters or anything that indicate what's on the inside. And in a way, in the same way that when you go backstage, the set is no longer there, the illusion that's created in the interior of the mall is lifted on the outside and in these backstage spaces, which once again plays into this idea of an oasis in a hostile environment, because the outside of the mall is neglected to the point where it it's just unattractive compared to the inside end, but even to other places in the city. And finally, about the way in which I established the class of the people in the interviews, or it did come up often in the interviews of just visitors to the mall. In the paper, I think it becomes apparent through the kind of shops that I described. So you have a lot of shops that, include luxury goods. And actually something I want to add is just a comparison to a cup of coffee, because I recently, actually in a newspaper article, there was a comparison of a cup of coffee in the mall to the average wage of a civil servant in Harare. And it was quite shocking, the difference there. Another way in which it's physically visible in the mall, I think, is through this very large parking lot where filled with big cars at all times, so that there are people in the mall. And so I think the accessibility of the mall, it shows on the one hand that most visitors are expected to have a car, and at the same time, the big difference between this very big accommodating parking lot and the minibus stop on the outside behind the fence and the ditch, where you have to walk through the ditch to get to the mall, reflects that in terms of wealth, there's a specific target group for the mall as well.
Thank you, Tonde. Mari, do you want to answer the questions?
Yeah. Thanks, Joe, for your question. The first part of my answer is to express a regret. The whole idea was to actually try and do some further interviews myself and try and actually talk to some of the users of the library, which would have enabled me to assess, to what extent the whole restoration project is only driven by the people of Bookbank, or whether there's wider ownership. But the libraries were closed at mid-March because of the COVID-19 pandemic, and they're still closed. And the schools in Kenya have been closed that long as well, and are expected to remain closed until January. And I suspect the libraries will do exactly the same thing. So it's been a real frustration of mine to not be able to actually go into the libraries and talk to people. A lot of the civil society organizations in Kenya are really middle-class enterprises. And I follow in particular my neighborhood's sort of association, and it's really interesting to what extent, these are organizations that are driven by very middle-class concerns of, wanting to do good charity work, a certain idea of what the common good is, but also a certain, rejection of everything poor, and a certain tendency to equate poverty and criminality. So there is something like that going on, certainly. But then on the other hand, it's got to be said also that Bookbank has really tried to move away from that middle-class domination, and they've conducted what looked like relatively comprehensive user surveys before they started the inventories and the restoration work. And so the way they have been doing the restoration work, they claim, and again, unfortunately, I haven't really been able to assess that, but they claim is really driven by the study, a very in-depth study of these surveys and talking to people and trying to take on board what people want these libraries to look like. So I think there is an awareness that, it shouldn't just be a middle-class project. But yeah, I think that class dimension is really interesting and important. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary. So we still have around 30 minutes for discussion. So if you have any questions, please raise your hands or type on the chat box. So there is another question for Julia and Ariane from David. So he says, since you had employed qualitative methods, you are not required to do a kind of correlation between the social backgrounds of participants and their views. However, the heterogeneity, I think, of participants may not be taken for granted to show the relationship. Still, you want to say, okay, so this is a kind of compliment rather than a question. So another question from Joe. Tony and Tony have their hands up. Okay, so Tony, I can't see people raising their hands. So Tony, can you speak?
Yes, thank you. Thank you for another exciting panel. So my question goes to Julia. 1 second, please. Yes, so Julia, we observed the chaos and disorder after the construction of these iconic buildings. But I'm wondering if the archives or the drawing board could also tell us about the chaos and disorder through perhaps the bureaucratic processes that produce these structures. So I'm thinking about whether there was a pushback against the construction of these buildings at the time of Houphouët-Boigny. And I also have a question for Irene. And I've always been thinking about Nkrumah's posture against imperialism. And so I'm always thinking how architecture could help us know the mentality of Kwame Nkrumah with respect to his own preachings against neocolonialism. And here, from your presentation, we see that he wasn't able to strictly limit himself to what we may call the indigenous or folk architecture. So what can this attitude, Nkrumah's attitude, what can it tell us about his own mentality towards that preaching against neocolonialism? Thank you.
Thank you, Tony. So we have two questions from Tondi and Philip. So Tondi, can you go first, and then Philip?
Thank you. My question is also to Irene, and it's about the contradiction between the state agenda and international involvement in the architecture. I think a previous question had already touched on this, but I just wanted to understand if the contradiction is more between the state agenda and the need for international involvement in terms of the need for the state actually relying on materials or plans and so on from international partners, or whether it's more about just the validation from the state, from international countries. So, for example, the fact that they needed approval of plans. Yeah, that's my question. Thank you.
Thank you, Tondi. Philip?
Thank you. Yeah, I think my question is around if we look at all of what's been presented about how this colonial architecture and just kind of erodes a lot of identity and molds that look like they're from a different part of the world. How that really divides in many ways. Like what kind of behavior change is needed that in African cities that there's going to be more locally inspired, more contextual architecture? Because what I see in, for example, in Addis Ababa is there is less, colonial influence, because obviously for obvious reasons, but they're all the malls. I mean, a lot of them just aspire to really look like a mall in Dubai, for example. Like you walk into a mall and there are like chandeliers and, golden curtains, or even if you walk into an office of a business executive of a company, like you walk into this office, be like, you're really trying to model a foreign office. And in the case of, like, from my experience, it's often more perhaps Middle Eastern, very elegant, kind of what you would see in Dubai. And that's often something you hear but even some, and so what I see in Ethiopia is this disconnect of local architects who really study the context and have great idea and great concepts. But people that really make decisions, whether it's politicians or people with influence, investors that build buildings, don't really give a space, give opportunities to these architects to realize these ideas. So although now you would have the space, Ethiopia could build whatever they want, it still looks very, very foreign in many ways. And I'm just curious, what steps do you think need to be taken that people, the elites, that makes the building decisions, whether it's politicians or business people, developers, like that they're really encouraged to go for more local solutions?
Thank you, Philip. Nick wants to ask questions. Nick, can you ask the question?
Hi, Nick Westcott here. Mainly a question to Julia, because I spent 4 or 5 years going to and from Abidjan regularly, and occasionally to Yamoussoukro. And what overwhelmingly struck me was the obsession with a Western modernism. Very little effort to adapt to local circumstances and local styles. And you see that throughout the sort of civic architecture, not only of Houphouët-Boigny's, but subsequently of Gbagbo's grand projet. It had to be bigger, better, more modern than everything in the West. That's quite different from the approach in some other places, particularly in Tanzania. Sorry, it's very dusty in here. I'm actually in SOAS, which is full of dust. In Tanzania, there was an attempt to adapt it to the circumstances, bring in some local style, except, of course, in Zanzibar, where Karume insisted on importing rock-solid East German flats for the people, which were totally unsuited to the environment, and people hate living in them. And this has really struck me that even now, particularly in Côte d'Ivoire, there is very little attempt to try and indigenize the architecture. Is that your impression too? Thanks.
Thank you, Nick. There is also a question from IB to Julia and Ariane, which says, since these buildings were constructed during the Félix Houphouët-Boigny era, how much do you think the realization of the state through these buildings is a function of the participants being nostalgic about that era? And also another follow-up question from Emmanuel. This is as a follow-up to Tony's question. I'm really interested in how, if public perceptions of these buildings might have changed over time. This is to Julia. So do you have other people raising hands? I can't see the function here on my side. So another question from Nahom for either speakers. So all of you probably. So can decolonizing architecture indigenize the colonial legacies towards civic architecture? So, Julia, do you want to answer the questions?
Yes, please. Thank you. I'm sorry about the dust at SOAS. Okay. I want to say something just quickly to Dawit about his follow-up to the first question, which was about this idea about how you sort of think about how different people see the state. And I think that's really important. But one of the things that I'm quite interested in is sort of generally, and this project is taking place in different African capitals. So the conversations are sort of being reproduced in different parts of the continent, is the idea of how ideas of the state are produced collectively or through relationships. So I really, it's like, so there's two things going on. One is that within the groups you have a conversation going on, and the power dynamics within the group and the way that ideas flow also tell you something about the way in which these discussions and ideas are constructed within relationships. And then putting the interviews alongside each other to sort of, again, look at almost like a kind of conversation that goes on between them. So it's more like a web, and I'm very keen to get away from the idea that these are isolated individuals who have opinions. So that's, one of the reasons why I'm not keen to sort of say, well, this group of young people thought this, that means that they represent young people and that's what young people think. I don't think that my data can tell me that. Tony Obviously the historian wants me to go back and look at the archives. Yes, of course. And you really reminded me of how the absolute importance of not treating the state as monolithic. So absolutely that idea that there would have been furious arguments going on, one imagines, and one would find, I'm sure, possibly, maybe if the archives existed, that would show that, and maybe that's work for you to do. I mean, it would be fascinating, and I need to keep in mind that idea that the state is not monolithic. But I'm afraid that my interest lies more in the sort of state-society dynamic, and I can't cover everything, and so I haven't really sort of gone there. Over time, the way that things change over time, public perception, again, it's and that kind of ties in, so that's Emmanuel's question, it also ties into IB's question about nostalgia for Houphouët-Boigny, and there's absolutely very powerful, that nostalgia. So the sense in which, obviously during the Ivoirian miracle period after independence, when, the economy was booming and when all of these iconic buildings were erected, and you had this sort of sense of the Ivoirian greatness, which has sort of so come unravelled during various crises since the end of his era. It very much, I think, colours the way that people look at those buildings. And so this sense of the fragility of the state is also, there's also kind of a kind of anxiety about, are we looking after his legacy properly? Are we fulfilling what was our duty to our founding father? This comes in quite a lot of discussions. So definitely that's an important part of it. I'm not sure about the sort of, I'm less sure about how the public perceptions change over time, in the sense that I don't have the data for it. I haven't been doing a sort of long-term study. We are about to enter into a period of doing more some sort of work on newspaper accounts of these buildings, which might capture some of this more nuance, and I'll get back to you on that when I find out. Philip's idea, it's a really good question, and it kind of ties into Nick's point as well about why is it that you don't see more attempts to create indigenous architectures of using local methods, local ideas. You do see it in some parts of the continent more than others. South African architecture is much more, tends to be locally designed, is much more tends to sort of try and think about, bringing in architectural ideas from historical pre-colonial history. It's quite difficult, and one of the problems is that modernity is very attractive. And Côte d'Ivoire is an extreme example of this, and Nick is absolutely right that there's, it's absolutely a kind of, we can do it as good as or better than the West. And so people often talk about the Plateau district in Abidjan as a little New York, and it's all about skyscrapers. It's absolutely, it's got no. Well, it seemed to me that it's got very little interest in trying to think about what an Ivoirian style might be like. And that wasn't something that was criticised in focus groups. That was something which was very much brought into, and it kind of ties into this idea of how important modernity is. And I think this comes out in a lot of the papers throughout the day, actually, about how difficult it has been right from the very beginning of independence. And you saw it with Nkrumah, certainly in Ghana, that, despite the fact that you want to create this distance from your Western history, sort of the colonial history and the West, actually modernity is very attractive. The idea of building these sort of very advanced buildings, people talk a lot about the importance of air conditioning and, sort of supposedly very modern features as a sign of something being good and beautiful and impressive. And that's true not just in Côte d'Ivoire, but in other parts of Africa that I've found as well. So I do think it's actually that dilemma and that ambivalence about modernity actually is quite usefully illustrative of all sorts of other debates about politics in parts of Africa. I'll stop.
Thank you, Julia. So, Mari, Irene, Tondi, if you want to answer some of the questions.
Just really quickly on the decolonizing agenda. In the case of the Nairobi libraries, the answer from Bookbank, I think, is really clear, is we're not going to really touch the architecture, but we're going to decolonize inside. And it ties in quite interestingly with what Julia was saying about, people finding buildings that they couldn't really enter quite beautiful, and then those buildings that they went into and that they felt were a bit chaotic were ugly. And I think there really is, it's an interesting dynamic there between the outside of the buildings and the inside and what is going on inside. And at least for the libraries, the answer seems relatively clear-cut, is we're keeping the outside, however colonial it might look. But we're going to change the books themselves. We're going to change what is most important, is what Book Bank says, is the books themselves. So I don't know. I mean, there's a real, there's a real pragmatism in Kenya about buildings and, and a sort of go and get it culture. And, I think you probably would say the same about Abidjan is, they want a big city with skyscrapers that looks quite Western and that's going to be built quite quickly. And whether it looks Kenyan or not isn't really here or there, I think.
Okay, so I would also want to comment on Tony's question and then Tonderai. They somehow tie in together. So Tony's question was on Nkrumah's attitude. Nkrumah, when he took over initially during the self-government period, his agenda or his idea was to establish a unique country, a country that would portray that they've come of age and they'll be able to do it now, or showcase that Ghana is of age, So then Nkrumah had the idea that it is self-government now. We want to dissociate ourselves completely from the colonial oppression or whatever. But then after a while, Nkrumah noticed that he could not do everything by himself, as I mentioned earlier, because of lack of resources, lack of skills and all that. And so he changed his agenda and then said that it is a tactical action. A tactical action because now he was realizing that he needed to involve other people or other nationalities in the building of Ghana. And that is also part of his state building agenda. So he wanted to depend on the foreign ideas and the foreign assistance and foreign skills and everything to be able to build his agenda and to also project Ghana and bring Ghana into the international scene. Unfortunately, from the comments that I received or the comments that I've come across in newspapers and in the archives, I noticed that people were not too enthused with his approach. So although Nkrumah, yes, realized that he needed to work with these people, the people that he was trying to solve the problem for were not too enthused and were not too excited about the whole approach, especially other parliamentarians and all that. And it got to a time Nkrumah was regarded as a dictator because he seemed not to really listen to the people, and so he was taking his own decisions. But then Nkrumah was in a dilemma because it was part of house building, provision of housing to address the housing situation was part of his political agenda. He had promised the people so much that he was going to give them better quality houses, he was going to improve the standard, he was going to make sure everyone was accommodated in a reasonably good housing. And that was, and yet he couldn't meet that kind of need. So I think there was a contradiction there. And as to whether colonial architecture erodes our identity, I don't think so. This is my personal opinion. I don't think colonial architecture really erodes our identity, because I believe that it is part of our history, and we can't do away with our history. We have to recognize our history and move or plan ahead. And then we should also realize that culture is not dynamic. Culture changes. And so definitely if culture changes, what we may claim to be locally designed ideas or traditional architecture may have been architecture that were adopted from other places. So personally, I don't think that we should do away completely with the colonial architecture because it is part of our history. But then we should see how best we can also come up with our architecture that addresses our needs. Thank you.
Thank you, Marie. Tondi,
Daniel.
Tondi, if you want to address Nahom's question on the concept of decolonizing architecture, and Ivy has also a question which reads as, in interrogating your idea of undiversified patronage of Saint-Lavis village ostensibly due to its exclusionary architecture, I would like to hear your thoughts about the possible effect/contribution of the type of shops compared to those that are found in the village walk. And to Irene, I am also interested to find out the rural-urban dimension of these housing projects. So, Tondi, do you want to comment on the questions?
Yeah, gladly. I'll start with the one from IB, which I find is a good question, which doesn't have one clear-cut answer. In the chapter, I do, when I'm using statistics to compare the visitors to the mall, I focus on cafes in the two different malls, which have a similar kind of menu to come a little bit away from that problem. So there are some shops which are similar, which do still display a different interaction with the public. But I do agree that one of the kinds of shops you're going to find in both malls have probably or definitely adapt to the kind of people that are coming there. I mean, this mall was built in the 90s and there have been some changes. There have been some cases of shops moving out of the village itself and into the village walk. So I do think that that's definitely a variable that comes into play, but I don't think it necessarily counteracts the idea of the effects of the architecture, because I think they work together. And then just briefly, the question from Nahom goes kind of hand in hand, I find, with a question by Philip about how one can encourage people to start building with more locally orientated solutions. And I think that's a very large question, which I can only answer from a small perspective. But I think one way would be in encouraging in building up the economy and encouraging production of local goods, which would build up people's trust in local solutions. Because I think that one of the big problems in countries like Zimbabwe, where the industry in many ways is failing, is that people then, I think the reason that people still, in some cases, are more likely to look at solutions from other countries is because there is, in fact, a lack of good quality local solutions. But at the same time, the question about when a building, a colonial building, for example, becomes part of the local context, and this now goes more towards the question about decolonization, it's not a clear-cut line for me either. And I find it interesting in this panel in connection with the buildings which Mary presented, because I do think, for example, in the library, the way that they've reworked the interior to make it more contemporary shows a deliberate attempt to go into this direction. And when you compare it, for example, to Sam Levy's village, where the interior of the mall has really been kept the way it was from the beginning, and no renovations have changed anything at all, does reflect a kind of lack of actively decolonizing buildings. So I think in that sense, that question is somewhat answered to an extent in this panel.
Thank you very much, Tonde. So by way of conclusion, Julia, this question from Nahum is also for you. If you want to say something about the concept of decolonizing architecture for a minute, then.
Is Marie going to also? Fine. Yes, I think it's an enormously interesting question, and I think a lot of the papers deal with it. I think Côte d'Ivoire is not the best example for this, because actually most of the architecture, all of the architecture I've talked about, was built after independence. And in fact, the kind of, although there are buildings which were inherited, on the whole, the best representation of the French period is actually in Grand Bassam, down the coastal road, which is a ruin, which is quite the idea of maintaining these colonial buildings in this kind of pathetic, rundown, overgrown, rotting state as a kind of I find it very powerful, actually, as a symbol of the kind of the sort of just watching that decay is something I haven't seen, and I did expect to see more in other parts of Africa, but it's very, very profound in Côte d'Ivoire. But in other, I'm not sure that's about decolonizing. It's certainly very powerful. I need to think about that a bit more. But certainly in other parts of the continent, so some of the buildings in South Africa, so they still live with these colonial or apartheid era buildings, which have the same function that they had. Like one of the most important buildings in South Africa is the Union Buildings, which was built by the British and was the house of apartheid. You have a police station in the middle of Johannesburg, which was absolutely key in some of the repression and the torture during the apartheid period, still a police station. You know, how do people deal with these legacies alongside some of the new buildings, so new police stations that are built to be more friendly and more approachable after the end of apartheid, or sort of suggestions that actually some of the big ministry buildings that have been erected to try and refer to some of the sort of ideas from some of the Great Zimbabwe, or some of the sort of really ancient architectural heritage of Southern Africa. So people have very mixed feelings about this, and some people really think that a proper state should be represented by these colonial style buildings, and they feel actually this is a proper state. Sometimes people make the argument that Irene made very powerfully about, well, actually this is what we are, you know, painful, difficult, problematic, but it's still, you know, that's what we are, that's our history, we can't just junket it, we can't get rid of it. And some of the new buildings that try and speak to these other sensibilities actually are not always, they don't always quite work. So people sort of say, well, you know, it's a bit sort of kind of a bit doesn't look like a proper police station. It's too soft. They don't have any power. It should be made out of bricks. It shouldn't be made out of these soft materials. So yeah, I think it's an enormously interesting and extremely complicated question to be continued.
Thank you, Julia. Mari, do you have anything to say about it? Okay, so thank you everybody for the wonderful presentations and questions. So our next panel and last panel will be convened after 30 minutes, yeah? I think so. Yeah, so see you in 30 minutes time.